The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched out like a cathedral made of starlight and ancient stone. Its walls carved with the histories of 12 founding species who had ruled the galaxy for thousands upon thousands of years. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the speaker's platform, a small human woman surrounded by beings that towered over her. Creatures with scales and feathers and crystalline skin. Entities that breathed different atmospheres and saw in spectrums she could not imagine. She had practiced her speech for weeks, had memorized every word, every pause, every gesture that might convince them to finally see humanity as worthy of respect. Honored members of the council, she began, her voice steady despite the weight of 300 years of human hope resting on her shoulders. The United Human Confederacy once again petitions for equal voting rights and full membership status. The murmuring started immediately. A wave of clicks and whistles and rumbling sounds that passed through the assembly like wind through tall grass. High Counselor Zethran of the Volanti rose from his elevated seat, his forearms spreading wide in a gesture that Elena had learned meant condescension, and his golden eyes fixed upon her with something between amusement and pity. Ambassador Vasquez, he said, his translator rendering his words in a tone of patient explanation. We have discussed this matter many times before, and the answer remains unchanged. With respect, High Counselor, Elena replied. Humanity has served this council faithfully for 3 centuries, and we have asked for nothing except the chance to be treated as equals, and you have been given much in return. Zethran answered. You were a primitive species when we found you, barely capable of reaching your own moon. And we lifted you up, shared our technology, allowed you to join the greatest civilization in the galaxy. Elena felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced in 100 meetings just like this one. We are grateful for what the council has given us, she said carefully. But gratitude does not mean we should accept permanent second-class status forever. The Marani delegate, a being of shifting shadows and cold light, spoke next in a voice like breaking ice. The humans forget their place, it said. They were admitted as a developing civilization, and developing they remain. For what is 300 years to species that have existed for millions upon millions of cycles? Around the chamber, heads nodded and appendages waved in agreement. Elena looked at the faces surrounding her, at creatures who saw her entire species as children playing at civilization, and she thought about everything humanity had done for this council when the Keth-Ari hegemony had threatened the border systems. It was human fleets that had been sent to defend them. Human soldiers who had died in the vacuum of space to protect worlds they would never be allowed to call home when the plague of Sorth had swept through the Volanthi colonies. It was human doctors who had worked without sleep for months to find a cure. Human scientists who had sacrificed their health to save millions of alien lives when the trade routes through the Meridian Corridor had become too dangerous for other species to maintain. It was human engineers who had built the navigation network that made safe passage possible. Human crews who had patrolled those dark spaces year after year, and what had humanity received in return? The right to serve, the privilege of being useful, and the endless promise that someday, if they proved themselves worthy, they might be considered almost equal. I must ask the council directly, Elena said, her voice hardening. What more must humanity do to earn your respect? What test must we pass? What sacrifice must we make? Silence fell over the chamber, a silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. Then High Counselor Zethran laughed, a sound like stones grinding together, and the other delegates joined him in their own species' expressions of amusement. Dear Ambassador, Zethran said when the laughter had faded, you speak as if equality is something that can be earned through effort. But some truths are simply facts of the universe. And one of those truths is that some species are meant to lead while others are meant to follow. Elena stood very still as the words washed over her. She had known, deep down, that this would be the answer. Had known it before she ever entered this chamber. But hearing it spoken so plainly still felt like a blade sliding between her ribs. "I see," she said quietly. "Do not take offense," the Marani delegate added. "Your species is young and eager, and these are admirable qualities in a servant race. So continue your good work, and perhaps in another 1,000 years we will revisit this discussion." Elena looked around the chamber one final time, memorizing every face, every expression of casual dismissal, every being who saw her people as nothing more than useful tools. "Thank you for your time, honored delegates," she said. And her voice was calm in a way that made several of the more perceptive species shift uncomfortably in their seats. She walked out of the chamber without waiting to be dismissed, her footsteps echoing against the ancient stone floors outside. The corridor stretched away into darkness, broken by pools of soft light. And Elena walked until she found a window that looked out upon the stars. Countless points of light scattered across the infinite black. She stood there for a long time, thinking about her grandparents, who had been among the first humans to join the council. Thinking about her parents, who had spent their lives serving alien masters in the hope that their children might be treated better. Thinking about her own daughter, who would grow up in a galaxy that would never see her as worthy of respect. Her communications device hummed softly against her wrist, and she raised it to see a message from Earth. From the President of the United Human Confederacy himself, Ambassador Vasquez. "We watched the session, and we are sorry." Elena typed her response with fingers that did not tremble. "Though perhaps they should have. They will never see us as anything but servants," she wrote. "I recommend we proceed with the contingency." The reply came faster than she expected, and it contained only 2 words that would change the course of galactic history. "Agreed. Proceed." Elena looked out at the stars once more, at the vast empire that had used her people for 300 years while offering nothing but contempt in return. Tomorrow, humanity would begin its withdrawal from the Galactic Council. Tomorrow, the galaxy would learn what it meant to lose the species they had taken for granted. And Elena Vasquez, Ambassador of the United Human Confederacy, found that she felt no sadness at all, only a quiet sense of relief that the waiting was finally over. She turned away from the window and walked toward her quarters, already composing the formal notice of withdrawal in her mind, already imagining the looks on their faces when they realized that the servants had finally decided to stop serving. 300 years of patience had come to an end. The time for humanity to demand better had finally arrived. The document arrived at every council embassy, every space station, every outpost, and every government building across the galaxy at exactly the same moment. Translated perfectly into all 400 official languages of the Galactic Council. High Counselor Zethran was in his private chambers when his aide rushed in with a datapad clutched in trembling hands. And the look on the young Valante's face told him that something unprecedented had occurred. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Zethran demanded. "High Counselor, you must read this immediately," the aide said. Holding out the datapad with all 4 of his arms, shaking, Zethran took the device and began to read. And with each word, his golden eyes grew wider, and his scales shifted from their usual proud crimson to a sickly pale orange. "This cannot be real," he whispered, but it was real. Every word of it, effective immediately, the document read. "The United Human Confederacy withdraws from the Galactic Council, and all treaties, agreements, and obligations are hereby terminated. All human citizens are recalled to Confederacy space. All human assets are to be reclaimed. And all human borders are now closed to Council traffic until further notice." Zethran threw the datapad across the room and watched it shatter against the wall. "Get me Ambassador Vasquez immediately," he roared, She has already left. High Counselor, the aide said. Her ship departed an hour ago. And all human diplomatic staff across the council have done the same. In the great chamber where Elena had stood just days before, chaos erupted as delegates from a dozen species shouted over each other in panic and confusion. This is an insult, the Morani delegate declared, its form flickering with agitation. They cannot simply leave. As no species has ever withdrawn from the council in all of recorded history. Someone must stop them. Another delegate cried out. How? Asked a quiet voice from the back of the chamber. And all eyes turned to Ambassador Tethys, an elderly Morani who had served on the council longer than most could remember. What exactly do you propose we do to stop them? No one had an answer across the galaxy. The withdrawal began in earnest. And it happened faster than anyone had thought possible on the manufacturing world of Keth Prime. Human engineers walked away from the massive orbital shipyards they had designed and built, leaving behind half-finished vessels and confused alien workers who had never learned how to operate the complex systems without human guidance on the medical station above Valanti 7. Human doctors packed their equipment and said quiet goodbyes to patients they had cared for, patients who begged them to stay. Patients who did not understand why the kind humans were abandoning them. I am sorry, Dr. Sarah Chun told a young Valanti child whose life she had saved just months before. We have to go home now, but this is your home, the child said. You have always been here. Sarah had no words to explain 300 years of mistreatment to a child who had only ever known kindness from human hands. So she simply hugged the small alien and walked away with tears streaming down her face in the Meridian Corridor, the most important trade route in the galaxy. Human patrol ships began their withdrawal one by one, their crews taking down navigation beacons and packing away the monitoring equipment that had kept the route safe for generations. Central Command. This is Patrol Vessel Horizon, Captain Marcus Webb reported. We are the last ship on station, and we are preparing to withdraw. Please confirm. Confirmed, Horizon, came the reply. You are cleared to return home, and may the stars guide your path. Marcus looked out at the vast expanse of space he had protected for 20 years. At the darkness that would soon swallow any ship foolish enough to enter without human guidance. It was an honor to serve here, he said quietly, though he was not sure if he meant it anymore. The honor was ours. Captain. The Horizon turned toward human space and engaged its engines, leaving the Meridian Corridor dark and empty for the first time in 200 years on Council Prime. High Counselor Zethron stood before an emergency assembly and tried to project calm authority. Fellow delegates, he said, I urge you not to panic, for this is clearly a negotiating tactic designed to frighten us into making concessions. And if it is not, asked Ambassador Tethys, then they will return on their own, Zethron replied confidently. They need us far more than we need them, and once they realize the foolishness of their actions, they will come begging for readmission. Will they? Tethys said. I wonder. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. And the humans did not return every transmission sent to human space when unanswered. Every diplomatic vessel that approached the border was turned away without explanation. And every attempt to contact human authorities was met with nothing but silence. The silence was the worst part. Many would later say the galaxy had grown accustomed to the constant presence of humanity, to their ships in the trade lanes and their voices on the communication networks and their hands, building and fixing and healing across 1,000 worlds. Now there was nothing. Just empty space where humans used to be. Just quiet where there had once been the busy hum of a species that never seemed to rest. They will return, Zethron said at the 6-month assembly. Though his voice had lost some of its certainty, they will return, he said again at the 1-year assembly. Though his scales had faded to a permanent sickly color, they will return. he whispered to himself in the dark of his chambers. Though he no longer believed it, the other species began to notice things. Small things at first, but growing larger with each passing day. Navigation beacons in the Meridian Corridor were failing without maintenance, and ships were disappearing at an alarming rate. Medical protocols that human doctors had developed were proving impossible to replicate, and diseases that had been controlled for decades were beginning to spread again. The engineering projects that humans had managed were falling apart, and no one else seemed to understand the complex systems well enough to keep them running. We never realized how much they did for us, Ambassador Tethvis said to his colleagues one evening. We never asked, and they never demanded recognition. They simply worked. Are you suggesting we were wrong to refuse their petition? Another delegate asked with offense in his voice. Tethvis looked at the reports piling up on his desk. Reports of failing systems and spreading plagues and trade routes collapsing into chaos. I am suggesting, he said carefully, that we may have made a very serious mistake, but by then, it was already too late. The humans were gone, and they had taken something with them that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. They had taken the invisible foundation upon which everything else was built, and without that foundation, the great civilization of the Galactic Council was beginning to crumble. The first great disaster came 6 months after the withdrawal, when the cargo vessel, Endless Fortune, vanished somewhere in the Meridian Corridor along with its crew of 300 Valanti traders and enough supplies to feed an entire colony world for a year. Search parties found nothing. Not a single piece of debris, not a single distress signal. Nothing at all to explain what had happened. The navigation beacons have failed completely. The search commander reported to the council. Without human maintenance, the entire network has gone dark, and flying through the corridor is now like flying blind through an asteroid field. 2 more ships vanished that month, then 5 the next, then 12 by the end of the first year. The Meridian Trade Corridor had been officially declared impassable, cutting off a quarter of council space from the rest of galactic civilization worlds that had depended on shipments from across the corridor began to starve, and desperate governments sent their own ships to try the crossing anyway. And those ships vanished too. We will build new beacons, High Counselor Zethron declared. Our engineers are more than capable of replicating human technology, but they were not capable. Not even close. The human navigation system had been a masterwork of engineering that incorporated sensors and algorithms and predictive models that no other species had ever been able to understand. And the Valanthi engineers who tried to reverse engineer the technology spent months producing nothing but failures. We do not understand how they did this, the lead engineer admitted to the council, her voice hollow with defeat. The complexity is beyond anything we have ever attempted, and we cannot even begin to grasp the underlying principles. The second great disaster came from the Cathari hegemony, that ancient enemy that had lurked at the borders of council space for millennia, held in check only by the vigilance of human patrol fleets, without humans to guard the frontier. The Cathari saw their opportunity and struck with overwhelming force. 3 colony worlds fell in the first wave, their defenses crumbling against an enemy they had never learned to fight on their own. Where are the human ships? The desperate colonists cried out as Cathari warships descended upon them. Why is no one coming to help us? No one came, because the humans were gone. And the Council's own military forces had grown soft and complacent after centuries of letting humanity do the hard work of defense. The Valanthi sent their proud fleet to stop the Cathari advance, and the Cathari destroyed it in a single battle, scattering the survivors across the void like leaves before a storm. How is this possible? Zethron demanded. We have the largest military in the galaxy. We have the largest military on paper, Admiral Vethris replied grimly. But we have not fought a real war in 300 years. Not since the humans began handling all our conflicts for us. And our crews have forgotten how to fight while the Ketheri have been preparing for this moment all along. The third great disaster was the cruelest of all, because it killed slowly and invisibly and touched every corner of the galaxy. The plague of Soroth had been under control for 50 years, held at bay by treatments and vaccines and monitoring systems that human epidemiologists had developed and maintained. Without those humans, the monitoring systems fell silent, and no one noticed when the plague began to mutate in the poor districts of Morani. Prime by the time the Council realized what was happening, the new strain had spread to a dozen worlds. "We need the human protocols," the chief medical officer of Morani Prime begged. "We need their databases and their research and their expertise. We have copies of their work," a bureaucrat replied. "Copies are not enough," the doctor shouted. The humans did not just follow protocols, they understood them. They knew how to adapt when things went wrong. They could think in ways we cannot. The bureaucrat had no answer for that. Billions died in the first year of the new plague, and billions more in the second. And the Council's medical institutes worked around the clock, but could not keep up with a disease that seemed to evolve faster than they could respond. "We never appreciated them," Ambassador Tethvis said one evening, standing in his office surrounded by reports of death and destruction. "We used them and mocked them and told them they were not good enough. And all the while they were the only thing holding our civilization together." His aide looked up from her work. "Do you think they knew?" she asked. "Do you think they understood how important they were?" "I think they understood perfectly," Tethvis replied. "I think they understood and served anyway because they hoped we would eventually see their worth. And when we made it clear that we never would, they decided to show us what our contempt would cost." High Counselor Zethron was found dead in his chambers 3 years after the withdrawal, killed by his own hand rather than face the shame of watching everything he had built fall apart. His successor lasted only 6 months before being assassinated by a mob of angry citizens who blamed the Council for the collapse of their lives. Fourth High Counselor was a young Volanti named Methara, who had spent her career in the diplomatic corps and who had once actually listened when humans spoke. She stood before the emergency assembly and looked out at the delegates who remained, a fraction of the original 12 founding species, many of whom could barely stand after the ravages of plague and war. "We have 2 choices," she said. "We can continue to pretend that everything is fine and watch our civilization die around us. Or we can admit that we were wrong and try to make amends. The humans will never forgive us." Someone called out. "Perhaps not," Methara agreed. "But we must try anyway, because the alternative is extinction." She paused and looked at the faces of beings who had ruled the galaxy for millennia. Beings who had never imagined that their power could end. Beings who were only now beginning to understand how small they truly were. "I will go to them myself," she said. "I will travel to the human border and beg them to return. And if they refuse, then at least we will know we tried." No one objected, because no one had any better ideas. The Great Galactic Council, that ancient institution that had lasted for 100,000 years, had finally learned a lesson it should have understood long ago. Some species are not meant to be servants. Some species are meant to be partners, and humanity had been trying to tell them that for 300 years while they refused to listen. High Counselor Mether's ship was small and unarmed, a diplomatic vessel designed for peaceful missions rather than the displays of power that previous council leaders had preferred. She traveled alone, except for a single aide, a young Morani named Kethris, who had volunteered for the mission despite knowing that they might never return. "Are you certain about this, High Counselor?" Kethris asked as they approached the human border. "No council leader has ever humbled themselves like this before." "Then perhaps it is time one did," Methara replied. "Our pride has cost us everything, and I will not let it cost us anything more." The border was marked by a line of defense stations that stretched across the void like a wall of steel and light. Human warships patrolling between them in formations that spoke of discipline and readiness. Mithara's vessel came to a stop at the designated waiting point and transmitted its diplomatic credentials. Then they waited. 1 day passed, then 2, then 3. Perhaps they will not respond, Kethris said on the 4th day. Perhaps they have decided we are not worth speaking to. Then we will wait until they change their minds, Methara answered. We have nowhere else to go. On the 7th day, a human ship finally approached. It was not the diplomatic vessel Methara had expected, but a warship, sleek and powerful and bristling with weapons that made her small craft look like a toy council vessel. You are ordered to follow us, came the transmission. Do not deviate from the assigned course. Methara followed without complaint, guiding her ship through the border defenses and into human space for the first time in 3 years. What she saw took her breath away. The humans had not been idle during their withdrawal. Not at all. Everywhere she looked, there were signs of growth and prosperity. New stations under construction, new ships being launched, new colonies spreading across worlds that the Council had never bothered to explore. They have built all this in 3 years, Kethris whispered in amazement. How is this possible? They were always capable of this, Methara said quietly. We simply never gave them the chance to show what they could do when they were not busy serving us. The escort brought them to a station called Unity Point, a massive structure that served as the headquarters of the United Human Confederacy's diplomatic corps there. They were met by a delegation of human officials who led them through corridors filled with activity and purpose. Past offices where humans worked on projects that Methara could not begin to understand. Finally, they arrived at a conference room where a single human waited for them. Admiral Chun Wei was old by human standards, his hair white and his face lined with years. But his eyes were sharp, and his presence filled the room with a quiet authority that made Methara feel like a child called before a stern parent. High Counselor Methara, he said. I am Admiral Chun, and I have been authorized to hear what you have to say. Methara had prepared a speech, had written and rewritten it 100 times during her journey. But now that she stood before this human, the words seemed inadequate. Admiral Chun, she began. I have come to apologize on behalf of the Galactic Council for 300 years of mistreatment and disrespect. Go on, Chun said, his expression unchanging. We were blind, Methara continued. We saw your species as servants rather than partners, and we refused to acknowledge your contributions, even as we depended upon them. And for this we are deeply sorry. Chun said nothing, simply waited. The Council is prepared to offer you everything you ever asked for, Methara said, her voice growing desperate. Full membership, equal voting rights, territorial concessions, financial reparations, anything you want. Just please come back and help us. For a long moment, Chun simply looked at her, and Methara could not read anything in his ancient human face. Then he smiled, and the smile was cold and distant, like the light of a star that had died long ago. High Counselor, he said. Do you know why we served the Council for 300 years? I do not, Methara admitted. We served because we believed that service was the path to acceptance, Chai explained. We thought that if we worked hard enough, if we proved ourselves valuable enough, if we sacrificed enough, eventually you would see us as equals, but we were wrong. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy station beyond. 300 years, we gave you everything we had, he said. Our engineers built your infrastructure. Our doctors saved your lives. Our soldiers died protecting your borders. And what did we receive in return? We know we treated you poorly, Methara said. Poorly, Chun repeated. And for the first time there was emotion in his voice, a controlled anger that burned beneath the surface. Your council laughed at us, mocked us in open session, called us a servant race fit only to follow orders. And you did this while we were dying to keep your civilization running. I know. And I'm sorry. 300 years of apologies might begin to balance the scales, Chun said. You have given me one. Methora felt tears forming in her eyes. An alien response she had never experienced before. What can we do? She asked. What can we possibly do to make this right? Chun turned back to face her, and his expression softened just slightly. Nothing, he said. There is nothing you can do because the damage is already done. And we have spent 3 years learning to live without you just as you are now learning to live without us. So you will not return to the council. The council as you knew, it is dead, Chun said. It died the day we left, and nothing can bring it back. But that does not mean there is no path forward. Methora looked up, hope flickering in our hearts. What do you mean? We will not rejoin a system that treated us as inferior, Chun explained. But we are willing to build something new. Something based on genuine equality rather than hierarchy. Something where every species is valued for what it contributes rather than looked down upon for what it lacks. What would that look like? Individual treaties with individual species, Chun said. Fair terms, mutual respect, no masters and no servants. Only partners working together because they choose to, not because they are forced to. And those who refuse to accept these terms will have to find their own way. Chun said simply, we will not help those who cannot see us as equals. And we will not pretend that their contempt does not matter. But for those who are willing to change, there is a place in what we are building. Methora thought about the council, about the Velanthi who still clung to their pride even as their empire crumbled, about the species who would rather die than admit they were wrong. Many will refuse, she said. Then many will fall, Chun replied. That is their choice, and we will not save them from the consequences of their own arrogance. Not again. It was harsh. Methora knew. But it was also fair in a way that the council had never been. I accept, she said. On behalf of my people, I accept your terms. Chun nodded slowly. Then let us begin, he said. We have much work to do. And for the first time in 300 years, we will do it as equals. 10 years had passed since the day humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council. 10 years that had changed everything the galaxy once knew. President Yuki Tanaka stood before a window that looked out upon the human corridor. The vast network of stations and trade routes that humanity had built in the years since their departure from a council space where once there had been empty void. Now there was life and movement and purpose. Ships from a dozen species moving along routes that humanity maintained. Not as servants, but as partners in a shared enterprise, Madam President, her aide said softly. The broadcast is ready. Yuki nodded and turned to face the recording equipment that would carry her words across the galaxy. She was not Elena Vasquez, who had walked out of the council chamber with nothing but hope and anger. And she was not Admiral Chun, who had laid the foundations of a new order with patience and wisdom. She was something new. A leader born from the ashes of the old world. And today she would speak to a galaxy that was still learning what that meant. Citizens of the Human Confederacy, she began. And to all those across the galaxy who are listening, today we mark the 10th anniversary of our withdrawal from the Galactic Council. A decision that many called foolish and reckless and doomed to failure. She paused, letting the silence stretch. They were wrong. Behind her, the human corridor stretched into infinity, proof of everything humanity had accomplished on its own. We did not leave because we hated the other species of the galaxy, Yuki continued. We left because we loved ourselves enough to demand better. And we left because we understood that no amount of service would ever change how the council saw us in what remained of council space. Beings of every species gathered around their screens to watch the Volanti had refused all contact with humanity, had clung to their pride, even as their empire collapsed into civil war. And now the last of their once great civilization huddled in the ruins of their homeworld. Too proud to ask for help, and too weak to survive without it, the Cathari hegemony had expanded aggressively after the withdrawal, conquering world after world until they had stretched themselves too thin. And now they faced rebellions on every front from species who had learned to fight back from watching humanity. The Morani had been among the first to accept humanity's new terms, had sent their own High Counselor to negotiate a treaty of equals. And now their civilization was slowly healing under the care of human doctors who came not as servants but as partners. The old order is gone, Yuki said. The Galactic Council that ruled for 100,000 years exists now only in history, and I will not pretend to mourn its passing. She thought of Ambassador Tethvis, who had been one of the few council members to understand what humanity truly meant to the galaxy, and who had worked tirelessly in his final years to help other species accept the new reality. He had died just 2 years ago, peacefully, surrounded by human and alien friends, who remembered him as a bridge between the old world and the new. But from those ashes, something better has risen, Yuki continued. Not an empire, not a hierarchy, but a network of free peoples working together by choice. She gestured to the window behind her. Look at what we have built. Not just humans, but all of us together. The Morani and the Vethkin and the Sorth, and 100 other species who were willing to see us as equals. The human corridor was more than just a trade route now. It was the heart of a new civilization, a place where beings of every shape and color worked side by side without the weight of ancient prejudice holding them back human. Engineers taught their skills to alien students who would carry that knowledge to their own worlds. Human doctors trained alongside alien healers who brought their own wisdom to share. Human soldiers stood watch beside alien warriors who had once been enemies, but were now brothers in arms. We are not perfect, Yuki admitted. We have made mistakes and will make more, but we have proven that another way is possible. A way that does not depend on one species serving another. A way that asks only that we treat each other with respect. She thought of the young ones, the children of humans and aliens who had grown up in this new galaxy, who had never known the old order and could not imagine going back to it for them. The idea of one species being superior to another was as strange as the idea of a flat world or a universe that did not change. They were the true victory. The proof that the suffering of the withdrawal had been worth it. To those who still cling to the old ways, Yuki said. And her voice hardened. We will not force you to join us. But we will not save you from the consequences of your own choices either. For we spent 300 years trying to earn your respect through service. And we learned that some respect cannot be earned. It can only be demanded. She let those words hang in the air. A warning and a promise rolled into one. But to those who are willing to stand beside us, she continued. And her voice softened. Not above, not below, but beside. We say this. There is a place for you in what we are building. She smiled, and it was a warm smile, full of hope for the future. The withdrawal rocked the galaxy. That much is true. But what comes after will reshape it forever. And this time, we will build something that will last. The broadcast ended, and across the galaxy, beings of every species began to talk some curse to humanity for their arrogance, for their refusal to return to their proper place, for the destruction they had caused by abandoning their duties. But others, many others, looked at what humanity had built and wondered if perhaps it was time to let go of the past High Counselor Methara, now an ambassador in the New Order. Watched the broadcast from her office on Unity Point and felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. The old world was truly gone. And she did not miss it. Not the hierarchy, not the prejudice. Not the comfortable lie that some species were meant to rule while others were meant to serve in. Its place was something fragile and new and beautiful. A civilization built on choice rather than obligation. On respect rather than contempt, she looked out her window at the human ships and alien ships flying together. At the stations built by hands of every shape and color. At the future that was being written every day by beings who had learned to see each other as equals. We should have listened, she said quietly to herself. We should have listened from the beginning, but the past was past. And all that mattered now was the future, a future where humanity stood not as servants, not as masters, but as partners in a galaxy that was finally learning what equality truly meant. The withdrawal had rocked the galaxy, and from that rocking, a new universe had been born.